Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Learner's Permit. This week I sat down and spoke with Nate Sand, who is just about to begin a master's degree in creative writing. So I knew that I had to talk to him a little bit about poetry and get his ideas about what poetry means in society. Because Nate and I are such good friends, we actually spent a lot of our scheduled time before we began the interview just talking and catching up, and that meant that we didn't have enough time to actually get a full-length interview on the first day. So this episode is split up into two parts, and you will be able to pretty clearly see the distinction between the two episodes, but I hope that the transition from the first interview and the second interview will be relatively seamless. It was really great talking to Nate, and I hope that you guys share some of his enthusiasm when you hear him speak about what poetry means to him. So thanks so much, and enjoy today's episode. Alrighty. Well, I'm here today with Nate Sand, and Nate, we're here to talk about poetry because you're someone who I think is much more versed in poetry than the average person.
Versed.
Yeah. There we go. But before we jump into it, I wanted to ask you something.
Sure.
Nate, would you rather have complete mastery over one language of your choosing, or have kind of a below average but conversational ability in every language?
I mean, that's an unfair question because I already have complete mastery of English, right? So I'd choose the second one.
Really?
I'd choose the second one anytime. That would be so much more versatile, right? I could go anywhere and talk to anybody.
It would be. It'd be much more versatile.
I mean, theoretically, could I advance myself in any of the languages if I study, or am I stuck at the conversational level?
Let's say that you could advance reasonably well, but there would be a hard cap on how good you could get, and it would be still kind of below average for what the average speaker who has that as their mother tongue could speak. And
then if I have complete mastery over a language, am I forbidden to study other languages? Is that inaccessible to me?
I'd say that you're not forbidden to, but you could never grasp any of those languages.
Actually, I'd complete mastery over English or whatever language I chose. That would behoove my writing career. And it would probably increase my chances of fame. Not that I want to be famous per se, but I want to be, published. Actually, I choose complete mastery over one language. It would be nice to know all languages conversationally, but the career that I want to pursue, I think it would benefit me most to, have complete mastery of English.
Yeah. I think there's something just a lot more appealing about the idea of just being a complete master, especially in a language like English or another very large language.
Yes.
That'd be so nice. And how often do you talk to people who have a different language than you, especially in America?
Yeah. That's true, especially Northern America. Yeah. That intrigues me because I wonder what complete mastery would mean, right? I'd assume that it means Nabokovian levels of mastery.
I don't know who Nabokov is, but beyond Shakespearean.
Excellent. Oh, beyond Shakespearean, yeah. Nabokov is English isn't even his first language. He wrote Lolita and a number of other wonderful, wonderful novels.
Sure.
He's one of my favorite authors of novels, and he is just so fucking good, man. I don't know if I should swear, but he is really, really good.
So wait, so Lolita isn't translated from his original writing? He wrote Lolita in English?
the dude's a master, man. He is Russian, right? And so he grew up speaking Russian, and he probably had French lessons and German lessons, I think. So he could speak those languages. And then he learned English as well, probably as a child. But he wrote his original novels in Russian, and then he fled Russia, and then he moved to America and translated some of his Russian novels into English, and then just began writing in English itself, and just starting with English.
Cool.
And his level of syntax and language use is to be admired, in my opinion, to a very, very high degree. He just doesn't have a wrong word, man. Like, it's almost frustrating. It's almost frustrating to read him.
Because you feel like you're not there, or like you feel like
Yeah,
it's
man.
almost like an attainable level.
It seems like it. I write in a different style myself when I'm writing prose, but like, if I were to try to imitate Nabokov, as I sometimes do in letters that I write, I find that I'm impressionistic style wise after I've been reading a particular, or at least a particularly like unique style of writing. I start to write in that style. Like if I'm reading Jack Kerouac, my sentences tend to be a lot longer in my letters than if I'm reading Hemingway. But like,
Sure.
I wouldn't ever read Hemingway, right? Because fucking, I'm not a fan.
You don't like the misogyny of Hemingway?
I don't like a lot of things about Hemingway.
Okay, okay. I've only read The Sun Also Rises, and I enjoyed it. I mean,
Interesting that that's the one you read, like over the Old Man and the Sea.
yeah. Well, I've heard that The Old Man and the Sea is really kind of grueling to read, and I've heard that it's like a beautiful book, but that it's just kind of a chore, and I decided I just didn't want to. I didn't want to go with that.
That's all Hemingway. I don't know about the man himself. I just don't like his style. Personally.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Well, okay,
But that's my opinion, of course.
yeah, and that's fine. That's fine. I don't have any strong love for Hemingway, so that's fine. But my first question to you, I guess my second question now. um, do poems have to rhyme, Nate?
You know, Ryan, that's a good question. But no, poems do not have to rhyme. As any high schooler who's delved into the realm of free verse poetry knows, making non-rhyming poems is certainly acceptable. That being said, a lot of people said high school people who are happy to know that poems don't have to rhyme take that to mean that they can write whatever they want and just however they want it, and it's a poem. And to a certain extent, it that's still a poem, like whatever you're writing. But I guess what I'm trying to say is poems do not have to rhyme, but you should still write them with thought, right? Like
Sure.
you shouldn't. Yeah, it should require some sort of I don't want to say effort, right? Because sometimes you can be inspired and just be writing, but like it should require some sort of purpose that you're writing for.
How do you determine if a poem is a good or a bad poem?
That is another good question. I guess it comes down to how it makes me feel, and feel in a couple of senses, right? Like if it makes me feel good to read the words and the words are fun to say, they tingle on my mouth or in my mind. If the emotion that's being conveyed is true, or at least true to me, and I have some spark of recognition in like, oh, I know what you mean, like that, like I feel that that you're conveying perfectly an emotion that I felt before but couldn't articulate. So that also plays into a poem's likability for me. I think I like the clever poem. I'm a fan of wordplay and the use of language to either pun or to kind of do a 1-2 on where you think a poem's going, and it might turn a different direction somewhat cleverly. Yeah, there's a lot of different factors, but it's a very ultimately it's a very personal question. Like you can teach uh, poetry and you can give examples of poetry that's kind of universally lauded, but I think it's dangerous to eschew other things and just take for granted that like what you're taught is good. And um, I don't know. I've always said for poetry and for other things that like what you like, and if you like a poet that is universally um, maligned, if you like it, man, keep reading. Keep buying. If it gives you purpose, if it gives meaning to you, that's really the important thing.
Sure, yeah. And I haven't thought about it until now, but I guess I've never read a poem that didn't seem like it had some emotional charge to it. Like I guess I've never read a poem that seemed like it was just describing something without like something below the surface that was at least kind of inspiring, or at least trying to be inspiring.
Hmm.
I hadn't thought about that. So you talked about whether or not a poem has truth in it. Whether or not it says something about the human condition, which we can take away from and kind of reflect on.
Yeah, and like I mean, the gravitas from poem to poem can also change, right? Like if you're writing a limerick, the point of a limerick is just the muse, right? But that's a poem, and it doesn't really have emotional weight to it per se, but it conveys the emotion of humor, right? And it's still conveying something, even if it's not like a heavy human condition type topic. But yeah, I think all poems should try to like convey something, right? Like that's why you write a poem.
Yeah, and so how
Uh,
do you feel about the demarcation of different types of poems? Because for a limerick, for example, that's 5 lines, right? And then the first and second lines rhyme, and then the third and fourth rhyme with each other, and then the fifth line will rhyme with like the first and second again. Is that how limerick
a
works?
funny old bird is the pelican. His beak holds more than his belly can. He can hold in his beak enough food for a week. I'll be damned if I know how the hell he can.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah, yeah.
so
So, yep, you're right.
yeah, it's like an AABBA format.
Yep,
Okay.
yep.
So maybe we could go through a little bit of poetry jargon, because
Sure.
there were always some parts of poetry that kind of eluded me. Because I've taken some creative writing classes, and I always enjoyed reading poetry, and I've enjoyed writing poetry, although I don't know if I'm particularly good at it. But um, there. So what's a stanza, Nate?
A stanza in a poem is pretty much a cluster of words and sentences, you could say, that is not demarked or demarcated by spaces. And so, if you imagine just like a paragraph, and then instead of starting the new paragraph right below it, you do a space, and then you start it. That's pretty much what a stanza is.
Okay. So would an author like Cummings, with his really creative like use of space on a page, would it be a little bit harder to determine where one stanza ends and another begins in his writing? Or
Definitely.
okay.
Definitely, it would be hard to determine what constitutes a stanza in that case. I mean, it varies, of course, from poem to poem for him as well, because he has poems that do just have more of a traditional stanza. But I don't. I think it's important not to overburden oneself with thought like that. If you like the poem, you like the poem, right? And like, it doesn't really matter if it stands out in a certain way or not.
Yeah, perhaps not. I guess
Yeah.
I guess I'm not completely sure. Um, but on that, if a poem is a poem, I remember in my creative writing class we had a little area in the semester where we were playing around with iambic feet, when we're
Yep.
trying to learn to write in like an iambic pentameter, or an
Right.
iambic.
And some sonnets.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, something like that. I guess for me, like in iambic foot or iambic feet, have always been really elusive to me because I know that it's basically like I've always thought of it as how many syllables you have per line, but it's not syllables per se, right? It's like stressed sounds, like stressed
Hmm.
words. Can
Um,
you help me get my head right on this?
yeah, of course. I'll try at least.
Yeah.
An iamb itself is a metrical foot, right? You break down metrics in poetry by feet, and you have disyllables and trisyllables. Potentially of like tetrasyllabics, but it's really disyllables and 2 and 3 syllables you're working with in the feet.
Right.
And an iamb is a 2-syllable unstressed stressed. So bada, 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 right? Um, and that was iambic pentameter. And so it's kind of tricky to take a word in and of itself and break it down into its metrics. It's easier to take a sentence, I think, and break it down by what it kind of seems like metrically. And so I guess to figure out what is stressed and not stressed in a single word, give emphasis, because you can break words into syllables, right, Ryan?
I hope so.
Yes.
Depending on the word.
And as long as you can do that, just practice giving weight to both sides or all sides of the word. And so if you're saying,
Centimeter.
give me a word, centimeter, is it centimeter or is it centimeter? Centimeter. Like you can just give like emphasis to all parts of the different syllables.
Yeah.
And one of them will feel a lot more right than the others. Centimeter, right?
Right.
Cent is the big stress of that word.
Usually, but then poets can also like play around with what they choose to stress in a word, right? And kind of come like especially if you're doing like spoken word poetry, you can kind of use that to I don't know,
Definitely.
like I felt small, I felt meter or something like that, right? And you could like say that you see yourself in the centimeter and like use like I've always felt that like when I'm trying to get my head around whether a word or whether like a couple of words are stressed or unstressed, I've always felt that it's just up to your interpretation of it, and that was what always screwed me up in writing poems. Like I felt like I could put words to paper, but then when asked to measure what was stressed or unstressed, I felt like it was just a different language.
I mean, like in free verse poetry, it can a lot of the time just be kind of up to you. Like poetic feet in the sense of traditional iambs and trochees and spondies or whatnot, like you can think about them more as a classical style of poetry, like Shakespearean, say, right? Sonnets, and more formal poetry that does consist of ba-da, 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 and different traditional meters like that. I have written a number of papers for college that argue certain syllabic things of different poems, and I have definitely stretched the syllabic truth of how you can interpret something to further my own ends. And so I'm familiar with that, like that it really is up to your interpretation. But these are ways to dissect poetry, right? And it gives you the knowledge of them, give you tools to write in a particular way that maybe suggests the import of a certain word because you might build up to it syllabically, da 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 like that, right? Or ba 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 ba, or the like. It gives you tools, and it gives you tools to analyze. But when you're reading a poem, the first thing I think of is not what syllables are going on here, like what are they doing syllabically that's so good. but it's more like the meaning that I'm getting from it. And sometimes the meaning is conveyed really well by the syllables. Sometimes it doesn't matter what syllables they're using. It matters more what they're saying. Yeah.
Would
Again, it goes.
I totally feel you on that. And I guess a follow-up question that I'd have for that is, does a poem have to be structurally sound in order to kind of like evoke a feeling in someone who's reading it? Like, does the poem have to really like fit together well on a basic level in order for you to read it with enough ease where you can kind of just look into like the feelings that the poem is trying to evoke?
I I guess I kind of take it for granted that if a poem evokes feeling for me, then yes, it achieves some sort of structural integrity. And if the poem that I'm reading is too clunky linguistically or syllabically, and it's kind of hard to read just because of the way it's structured, it won't convey the emotion as well that it's trying to. And so I kind of combine those two things. But if a poem isn't structured well, I think that it takes away from the overall meaning of the poem, and so I wouldn't get as much from it, and I wouldn't think as highly of it as a poem.
Sure. Sure.
Yeah.
Well, on your note about just reading poems and enjoying them for the poem that they are instead of breaking them down, do you want to spend some time maybe reading the poems which you suggested for this week and kind of digging into them a little bit?
I would love to.
Okay.
What poem would you like to start with?
Ooh. So you suggested three. The first is For Once, Then Something by Robert Frost. The other is Papulæ, Order 1 by Sylvia Legris. And Poem 7 by E. Cummings. What if we started with, I think, the one which was the most difficult for me? What if we started with Papulæ?
Sure.
Okay.
Would you like me to read it?
Please, I'd love that.
All right. Papulæ, Order 1 by Sylvia Legris. Legris? Genus 2, Lichen. On a scale of lustrous to sockeye, fish scale to fire dot, not ichthyosis, lichen, fruiting bodies in a calcareous spot, gold spit, blushing. Oh, the diffuse eruption of dazzling papula. Usher the wild lichen, usher spring, and the furfurcaceous scurf recurs. The brain scaled, the hairline cracked, the blue blistered, the earth wrinkled, neither strophulous nor stoppable, like wildfire rash and crustose rush of successive crops. Tundra, sulfur, circumpolar, the snowy extrications. So squat the dog lichen, the freckle pelt, cobblestoned, chronic, not contagious. The not contagious. No. And that is the poem.
Awesome. I didn't realize how much I liked the line and the furfuraceous scurf recurs.
Furfurcaceous. I think I pronounced that wrong. Yeah.
It sounded really nice when you read it though, so I didn't realize kind of how well the lines fit together. What does this poem mean to you? What is how do you interpret it? Because for me, I read it and I realized that I had to look up I think 7 of the words. I had to, in a pretty short poem, I had to look up a larger majority of the words than I would expect. And when I did, I realized that they were mostly just technical terms for various skin rashes.
Yep. Furfuraceous, for example, means to be covered or characterized by brown-like scales, right?
Yeah, and ichthyosis is a skin condition which the epidermis becomes dry and horny like fish scales. And
that makes sense. Ichthy, yeah.
Yeah, and lichen or is it lichen or lichen? That one. I wasn't.
It's lichen.
Okay. And for lichen, it's also a skin disease with hard round lesions occurring close together. Scurf
But
are like dandruff flakes.
you actually went past, I think, the meaning of this poem when you said lichen. When you passed lichen, this poem is about lichen, right? It says genus 2 lichen. And also, I guess I'd take it a little for granted because I know Sylvia Legris or at least a little more of her body of work. And she, it seems to me, loves to deal with technical, what's the word, biological systems. And so she's got a whole book about birds, and she talks about, I think it's geese. For each poem is different things about geese and like very technical. I don't know,
Like
but
jargon
just
almost. I mean, like words
yeah,
that
yeah,
like the lay person wouldn't know. Like only people within that field would probably know those
yep,
words, right?
yeah, exactly. And so she loves to play around with those words and then to use them in a way that goes beyond just the meaning of the word itself. Perhaps and she puns on them too, right? Like even in the furficacious scurf, right? Furfuracious curf. Just putting scurf after furfuracious is like, that's wordplay to me because it means something. Furfuracious meaning the whatever brand like scales, and scurf meaning flakes
like
on the surface of a skin.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think it's wonderful how she does that, how she puts words together that have kind of a fun way of saying it. But it also means something. She's not just doing it for just because she can. She's doing it because it means something.
Yeah.
And so the way she talks about lichen, to me, and why I like this poem, it feels like I'm talking about lichen. It's like, this is how I would talk about lichen if I could do it purely. I talk about it in the blue blister, the earth wrinkle, the strophulous nor stoppable. Like, this poem is fun for me to read. I think it's even more fun to read out loud because it is fun to pronounce these words. It's fun to connect them. And again, the surface reading for me too, Ryan, I also had to look up a lot of these words. And so this poem didn't have as much meaning for me the first time I read it as the, say, second or third when I knew more of the words and their meaning. But even the first time I read it, it was still a poem that I enjoyed because of how she scaled the relation of her words.
Scaled. Yeah. Okay. I think I'm coming away with this poem with a little more of appreciation for it because, yeah, I agree that it seemed like it's almost like an adulation for lichen. Like it's, or
Yeah.
maybe it's not. I don't know. Maybe it's just her really celebrating like the different ways that you can describe it because it's just her describing it.
Yeah. And usher the wild lichen, usher spring and the furfuracious scurf recurred. Like, she must take joy in it. I think like this poem to me contains a sense of wonder and joy, right? Like if you go, a lot of times I think people feel like if you go over technical with things, it kind of drives the life out of it. And I actually feel that way about poetry. If you overanalyze something, or English in general, you run the risk of just analyzing the joy out of it. But here, Sylvia Legris is using really technical terms and kind of some unique syntactical and linguistic word combinations, not to overcomplicate, right? Like, I don't feel any pretension in this poem. I feel a sense of respect, right? Like, she's talking about this, and she's using these terms because she really wants to be precise about something that gives meaning to her. And then I guess I feel that meaning myself. And that's one of the reasons that it's a successful poem for me.
Okay, you're winning me over on this because I came into this thinking that like it was a little pretentious because I mean if I I guess just the fact that she used so many technical words that the average person
Hmm.
wouldn't know, I kind of came away from this poem originally thinking like, oh, what an elitist. But I mean, it could be that the poem just, has like a higher entry level that you need. Like it takes a technical vocabulary, and you need to really know what those words mean in the moment in order to read it smoothly and enjoy it. Because I didn't really get any of the, um, I don't know, I understood that she was excited about Lycan, some of that excitement shone through for me, um, but it almost seemed like the poem was like too difficult for me to understand, and I think that's kind of a problem that some people feel plagues poetry, in that it's
Hmm.
I don't want to overuse the word elitist, but the fact that it has such a high entry level, like I feel like I don't know if I would pick this poem out of a poetry book after a first reading and say like I enjoyed this, like I almost feel like I'm not.
Hmm.
I'm relatively well read, and I felt like this was almost too difficult for me personally. Um, is that a problem that is new in poetry, do you think, or is that something that's kind of always? I mean, since it's always playing with language, I imagine poets probably in general have a pretty good vocabulary and probably have a love of finding new words and using new words. So maybe it's different from the inside, from the other side.
Um, that's definitely a problem that poetry has. That I have many friends who, if they don't get a poem kind of on the first reading, or if they're not getting the gist of it, they'll put it away, right? Because they don't want to put in any more effort to get meaning out of it.
Mm.
Sometimes for poems, though, you got to read it 2 or 3 times. You got to look up some words. But once you do that, and once you put an effort to the poem, you get a lot more out of it than you maybe thought you would or thought you could. Um, and so it's hard to tell which poem sometimes to choose, to put meaning, to put effort into, to get meaning. But reading is not like a submissive thing. In my opinion, reading is something that you have to engage, whether it be it poetry or prose. The reader should be ready
Active.
to meet the author at least halfway in what they're reading. And if that means looking up a couple of words, so be it. But I mean, there definitely is poetry that's overly pedantic and overly erudite, and just for the sake of being, uh, smart poetry or like high-minded poetry. Uh, so
Yeah,
yeah, that's definitely a problem that certain poems and certain poets can encounter. Sure.
I guess it's a little bit. I'm realizing now that I've read, David Foster Wallace, and I mean, he is an author that uses an insane amount of technical words that you
Hmm.
have to look up, and that never bothered me. And I guess it's probably because of the length of the piece of art that I'm consuming. Because for poetry, because poems are kind of bite-sized, because I almost feel like I can just jump in and read it and get it and leave. That I feel like I have a less of a obligation to really do some work. And
Sure.
I realize that when I read novels, I'm fine with that work because I'm ready for it. But you must, yeah, I assume that you're right on that. That you kind of you have to meet the author halfway, and I did, because I did look up those words, and I realized that it's a poem about lichen or about skin
Yeah.
issues. And then my question after that is this just a poem about lichen? Is this just exploration of ways to describe skin issues, or is there something like beneath this poem that I'm missing? Is there something more than that to this, Nate?
I mean, it comes down to opinion, right? Somebody could read this poem and go, "Oh my gosh, that explains my life." But no, it doesn't. To me, it's just about lichen, and
Okay.
it's about her talking about lichen, and I think she talks about it dazzlingly. I have a greater appreciation for lichen for reading this poem because of how enthusiastic she seems to be about it, right? Sylvia Legris, I'm sure, is not somebody who just knows all these words before she writes this poem. Like, I would bet almost hands down that she had to look up a couple of words of skin diseases, right? And things to like put down when she thought about a poem about lichen and how to describe lichen. But like, I mean, I like lichen a lot, so there is a bias there. I really enjoy mosses and lichens and all those sorts of things. And so in my mind's eye, I have a very good idea of what I think lichen is to be like. And to read this, even to some of the fish-scaled fire dot, not ichthyosis lichen. Well, you're saying a lot of and kind of like clicking, clashing words that kind of feels like rough, right? It kind of feels rough to read, and even that to me conveys a sense of lichen. How lichen is kind of not a smooth thing, but kind of a hoary thing on rocks. And I don't know. I think she does it. She conveys lichen in a way that I relate to very well.
Well, your excitement for this poem is contagious because I'm sold on it now. I came away changed on my opinion of this, and I didn't necessarily expect to.
You might enjoy other poems, but if you go to you or whoever might be listening, go to poetryfoundation.org. They have a wonderful database of poets, and then certain poems by the poets. And so you can look up Sylvia Legris and find a number of her poems. She has some on hollyhocks and other different biological things that are similarly technical. This is her style, to use words like this and to combine not just the meanings but the sounds when you form them in your mouth. But yeah, I'd recommend it.
Right on. Very cool. Yeah, and speaking of poetryfoundation.org, is where you linked me all of these poems that we're going to be reading today. Yep. So I'll definitely drop a link in the description of this video and on the website so that people can check it out and so that people can read the poems as we're reading them aloud.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Speaking of, can we move on to For Once Then Something by Robert Frost?
Yes, certainly.
I think that this is probably my favorite of the three. And
cool.
Yeah, I think it's also because I was able to grasp it with some immediacy, which I enjoyed.
Uh-huh.
It was nice. And if you don't mind, I'd like to read it. I'd like to take a crack at it.
Go for it.
Okay. For Once, Then Something by Robert Frost. Others taunt me with having knelt at well curbs, always wrong to the light, so never seeing deeper down in the well than where the water gives me back in a shining surface picture, me myself in the summer heaven godlike, looking out of a wreath of fern and cloud puffs. Once, when trying with chin against a well curb, I discerned, as I thought, beyond the picture, through the picture, a something white, uncertain, something more of the depths. And then I lost it. Water came to rebuke the too clear water. One drop fell from a fern, and lo, a ripple shook whatever was there at the bottom, blurred it, blotted it out. What was that whiteness? Truth? A pebble of quartz? For once, then something. Oh, diesen Tag. Thank you, thank you.
Yes,
Um,
yes.
yeah, I like this. I like this poem a lot, and as I said, I think it's because I was. This is kind of more in the style of poetry that I'm used to reading, and I guess
Hmm.
probably better at writing. So it was something that I was able to identify easier, which is really nice.
Hmm.
I especially liked the the fourth and the fifth line. Deeper down in the well than where the water gives me back in a shining surface picture. Um, because for me, I get this idea of a man standing at a lake, looking into the lake, and metaphorically, oh, I mean, like literally trying to see beyond the reflection, which is cast from the water back to him into
Hmm.
deeper water, but also metaphorically trying to kind of peer beyond the surface of nature in order to gain some greater understanding of like a true reality beyond what his everyday senses are telling him.
Yeah.
But I really like the idea that, and not only like the surface picture of that line, but when he said that deeper down in the well than where the water gives me back. I thought it was so cool because that line made me think that not only is like the water reflecting back to him the way that he is, but it also made me think that the water had like captured his image, and it was the water's um, like the water got to choose whether or not it gave him back. You know, the fact that the water gives me back in a shining surface
Hmm.
picture, for some reason, made me think that like he wasn't only peering into the deeper nature of reality, but also kind of trying to peel away layers of his own psyche. It was nice. I enjoyed it.
Cool, man. Like, I'm very glad you enjoyed this poem. This is my favorite Robert Frost poem, hands down. I
Okay.
had the privilege I had the privilege to take a whole class in college that was just devoted to Robert Frost. And so I read pretty much all of his poetry uh, and different essays by him and different analyses of his poetry. And it was just all about Robert Frost. And so this is the poem that I've actually studied and wrote about. And so I'll admit to having a deeper knowledge of this poem than the other two. Uh, and so I chose these poems to give a little variety, or to try to at least to give a variety in what poetry can achieve. I chose the Sylvia Legris piece, Legris, however, um,
Yeah, it depends on how
because of just
French you want
more.
to get it.
I think she's Canadian, so it would be probably French. Um, you just for the words, I love pronouncing that poem, even if you don't know what it's talking about. Like I, not everyone, I guess, appreciates just words for the sake of words, but that's something that I love. And so that poem particularly is appealing to me just because of how it talks about a certain, small issue. Like in this poem, is a little bigger in its scope.
Mm.
And so what this poem is kind of doing, and for my understanding of it, I don't want to say this with absolute certainty in case I'm wrong, but people accused Robert Frost, back when he was in his publishing days, of being kind of a simplistic poet, and that he'd write about nature scenery, and that he wasn't like deep in that sense, and it wasn't as educated, maybe is a word you could use, in his poetry. And
Mm.
so this poem is actually a response to that. And you can kind of see that in a couple of ways and a couple of the things he's doing. This poem is in a hendecasyllabic meter, which means pretty much just 11 syllables. And there's different metrical feet that make up a hendecasyllabic meter. And there's a little variation you can use in it. But the probably the most famous user of hendecasyllabics was the I think it's Greek. Oh no, sorry, Roman. Catullus. The Roman poet Catullus used pendecasyllabics in most of his invective poetry. And invective poetry is poems that are written to have a certain punch at a certain topic, right? And so you can imagine an invective poem about Donald Trump, say. It's pretty much criticizing Trump and saying why he's bad. So it's a poem that has a purpose that is negative towards something. And so he's using that pendecasyllabics. So that's calling to mind Catullus and calling to mind invectives. And so you could look at this poem as an invective against Robert Frost's critics, right? Others taunt me with having knelt at well curves, always wrong to the light. So that's pretty much, to me, saying my critics accuse me of just like not looking to the light, right? They have, of not being doing the right things.
Literally.
Yeah, exactly. And so they just blame him for being kind of like a simpleton, right? He's just staring down into the well. But he turns that against him, right? By showing this poem and by writing these wonderful images. I love the imagery of this poem.
Yeah.
Like you said, deeper down in the well than when the water gives me back, in a shining surface picture, me, myself, in the summer heaven godlike. I think that's such a good line. Me, myself, in the summer heaven godlike.
And then the idea that he has a wreath made of fern and cloud puffs is even that's even nicer if this is his like rebuke to critics, because it's almost as if he's saying like, this is my kingdom, like this nature.
Yeah, like
is who I am.
Exactly, man. It conveys the mastery that he has of it. And even the ferns, right? Like a wreath of fern and cloud puffs calls to mind like laurels of Greek and Rome. Again, invective poetry. And so, yeah, I just find this poem fascinating for many reasons. I love the imagery of it. The imagery is fantastic. I think the meaning of it, about kind of an address to potential critics, or at least potentially an address to critics, gives it even deeper. I don't even know if deeper is the word, but just like a different meaning that you can read it with, which adds to its appeal to me. But you don't need it, right? Like, I enjoyed this poem before I knew that it was potentially an address to critics. But when I know that it's an address to critics, you can even uncover more about poems. And so it kind of goes back to what we were talking about how much you want to put into a poem, right?
Yeah, for sure. And that actually that reminds me of a conversation I was having in episode 2 of this podcast, Learner's Permit. I was talking to my friend Pedid, who is a music critic, and we were talking about hip-hop in general and how, for me personally, I am more deeply invested in the the context surrounding a hip-hop song than other music, because I think in hip-hop that's more important, that you kind of have some of that context. And I'd never thought of that in poetry. Like I read a poem and for me it's almost always just in a vacuum. Like it's not related to whatever the poet was going through. It's just me, again, just like having a piece of literary candy, on the go without really investing in it. But I agree with you. It does add more when you kind of understand the context behind it.
Yeah, definitely. And originally poems were not just little things, right? Like it started out more as like epic poetry, right? I keep saying right, I'm sorry.
I don't know if it's right.
Right, you agree with me, right? But like the Iliad and the Odyssey and Homer's poetry, and it was things that you recited. I want to say it again. And it was a way to carry on the tradition, and it was a way to convey stories. And so there is a lot of poetry that's just as long as novels. Though I think a lot of people just think of it as, sonnet length or less.
Yeah. Yeah, I think
So it's not always the case.
again, I mean, that's kind of what I expect, and that's definitely not fair, I think, to the practice of poetry. But I also feel like I have to seek out poetry. Like I don't necessarily think that it's such a large like force in our culture. Like I think it's not something that's in your face almost ever in American
Hmm.
culture at least. And so like my understanding of poetry is much more narrow than a poet's, but also not much more narrow than the average American. So
Hmm.
like the idea of like a long poem is almost a little bit foreign to me.
Yeah, like, and uh, different long poems achieve different things. Like Beowulf is a poem. If you've read Beowulf, technically those things are poems, and they were originally meant to be spoken aloud to continue orally the traditions and the stories of whatever society. Um, but I don't know quite where I was going with that. so,
Poems
so I will
can
not
look
continue.
different.
Yes,
um,
they can.
Nate, I have to go soon, and we haven't even
Hmm.
covered a fraction of what I was hoping to talk about. Do you think that we could meet again sometime in the near future to continue with part two of this?
I would sincerely enjoy that. Yes.
Ah, lovely. Then I think let's take a break here, and in the digital world, when people are listening to this, it'll just be a couple of seconds before they hear the next portion of
just
this.
just like magic.
Just
It's
like
magic.
magic.
That's how I want you to begin this segment. This second, all incriminated.
Well, welcome again, Nate, to the second part of our discussion on poetry.
It's
Um,
good to be back.
it's good to have you. And yesterday, as we were leaving, we were right on the cusp of some pretty meaty conversation, I feel. So why don't we just jump into it? Nate, does
Sure.
poetry matter in society? Is this something that it's okay? It's kind of pushed to the side.
Um, when I give you my opinion, it's important to keep in mind that this is just my opinion. But I do have thoughts on that topic. Meaning itself, if we take a bigger step back, um, uh, if I say this to my parents, it's kind of scandalous, but I believe that there's no inherent meaning to anything. Um, that, but that doesn't mean that there's no meaning to things. The meaning that exists in the world is meaning that man creates for it, and creates for her or his self. Um, and I think you can apply that to a broad spectrum of beliefs, um, of motives and stuff. And if you apply it to poetry, um, the meaning that poetry holds for the world, really comes down to the meaning that it holds individually for people. Um, and so it's hard to, I think it'd be actually hard to make an argument why poetry um, is still extremely needed in society. Um, because I believe it's more of a individual case that it can be extremely needed by individuals. And that's not to say that somebody who wouldn't seek out poetry uh, couldn't benefit from having somebody like show them a poem that might help them understand themselves more or have a greater appreciation of some beauty. Um, but it's a choice, and so if you don't choose poetry, uh, hopefully you're choosing something else that's giving you, I think, the same things that I find in poetry. Um,
What is that?
but yeah, so
What is it that you find
I,
in poetry that you think someone else could find in different art form?
um, catharsis is a big reason that I enjoy poetry. Emotional catharsis, and so whether it's understanding a feeling, like reading a poem and having it reflect back to me how I'm feeling about something in a more articulate way than I understood it before, really helps me. And you can have catharsis, I think, not just on like emotional issues that are like working past problems, but you can have like catharsis of beauty, or just a release of emotion regarding certain topics. And whether that's beauty and appreciation of nature, or like lichen, or whether that's Robert Frost using smart Roman poetic meters that take a jab at people who accuse him of not being intellectual. Yeah, just emotional release. It's kind of a basic answer for poetry, but it's an important thing for me, at least. What do you get from poetry, Ryan, generally?
Um, that's a good question. I guess, as I said before, like I don't think I've read a poem, or at least like appreciated a poem that was emotionally neutral. Like every poem that I've read feels like it's at least trying to poke at some sort of like feeling portion of me. You know, like
Mm-hmm.
it seems like it's the poet's idea that they want to create something which is at least a little bit moving for someone. So I guess I enjoy the idea of being moved, and it's also, I mean, oftentimes it's kind of a interesting like narrative that you get from poetry. Like it creates a narrative which we can use to kind of like explore nooks and crannies of our lives, that like maybe we didn't even know that we had. Um, so I like the idea that you could like read a poem and it'll almost make you feel like nostalgic for something you never had, or like
Mm-hmm.
like a poem which can really make me I guess like a poem with which I can resonate, and I can really feel that it is kind of attuned to a certain part of my everyday experience, or maybe not everyday experience, but my experience through my life, that I wasn't like attenuated to before. So it's a way that for me to kind of
Mm-hmm.
like tap into that specific frequency that I think the poem is trying to really get at. Um, and on the flip side of that, I also wonder if poetry kind of creates those nooks and crannies through that type of reflection, in the way that like being exposed to like a good piece of writing, or a good I don't know, philosophy can help you think about the world in new ways. I also wonder if like poetry is also kind of creating parts of our psyches, through kind of like a fictional and dramatized dramatized version of the world. Yeah, like the fact that like you have this like dramatic account of lichen gives you like an appreciation for lichen beyond just kind of uh, like looking at moss or like scaly skin.
Yeah, like when I look at lichen from now on, some part of me is going to remember that poem, and whether it's like consciously recognized, or not, or whether it's just beneath the surface, I'll be looking at it differently than I would have otherwise. And and I get this magazine called Poetry Magazine. It's a cool little chapbook of poems that comes out monthly,
Aptly
and
named.
yeah, it lives up to what the title says. Um, and so poetry also, like you were touching on it, it's a good way to build empathy and to get different perspectives on issues. Um, because a lot of the time, for me, if you watch the news and you watch different protests for Black Lives Matter, or the um, Dakota Access Pipeline type things. You can see what's there, and you can see the injustices that are being committed, right, against these different groups of people. But it's harder to connect a direct emotion by just watching the news for me. It's a lot easier to gain empathy from reading about the people's stories. And so in Poetry Magazine, they've been very good about publishing different minority groups poetry that addresses these different police brutality issues, say, or water rights issues. And for me, that's a wonderful way to try to gain perspective and empathy and just a deeper compassion for fellow human beings. So I think that matters. And that's a really big reason why poetry is still significant. And whether it's a vital part of humanity or not doesn't matter as much as the potential that it has to be significant. And again, whether you're finding that through poetry or whether you're reading Facebook stories on specific people, I think everybody should be trying, try to understand each other better.
Yeah, I guess that's a nice idea. That everyone could understand each other a little bit better and maybe gain something from that. But that made me think, do you know of any conservative poets? Just thinking about the Dakota Access Pipeline and Black Lives Matter and other like social issues which have come up in the past couple of years. Is poetry mostly dominated by more liberal people?
It's a question I can't answer, I don't think, quite accurately because of the confirmation bias that I inherently exhibit when I read poems and choose to read the poets that I read.
Sure.
I haven't came across many. I couldn't name any names for you that would be like a conservative poet.
Yeah, I'm trying to think like specifically like the idea for me of like a socially conservative poet seems like paradoxical.
It does seem weird. Like Poetry Magazine is definitely liberal, a liberal publication, and I mean it. Hopefully not like discriminatory, and they certainly don't seem so to me. But that's my big exposure really to poets, and then from the poems I like, I buy different chapbooks of specific people's poetry I like, and I branch out from there. But yeah, so from what I know about it, I really couldn't tell you. I'm sure there exists somewhere a poet writing conservative little verses, but
maybe we'll find.
I don't know how. Yeah, maybe.
So to pivot a little bit, yesterday we also talked briefly about epic poems, and I've wondered for some time now, what is the difference between an epic poem and a novel or a novella? Because from what I've read, an epic poem is a poem which is mostly focused on like one or two characters, and it's usually an adventure. So how could that be different than a novella, for example?
Quite simply, it's just what comes down to the difference between poems, any poem, and prose writing is just a line control. Poems have a controlled line and line breaks. You have more specifically for epic poems as well, they're usually structured metrically in a system. Like the Greeks had dactylic pentameter or something like that. Don't quote me on that. But when Homer, or not Homer, but well, whoever finally wrote down the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? They were phrasing it in meter, and because it was originally an oral poem and it wasn't written down, it was passed from person to person. it was a way to help memorize too, and to be able to have a rhythm to how you're speaking that like leads you onto different tropes that are repeated again and again, which is really fascinating stuff, actually, like analyzing why the Iliad and the Odyssey and different epics were like originally oral and the different little clues in there, but I digress.
Sure.
So yeah, and then the classic English epic meter is iambic pentameter. If you read like Pope's translations of the Iliad and the Odyssey, which I am a big fan of, that's the, and then it rhymes, right? It's got couplets, rhyming couplets, and that also has to do, well, back in the Greek with memorization stuff, but not so much in the English. But then that holds true for like the Mahabharata in India and different epics too. It's the metrical line and then the control of the line length, right?
Okay, so really it just comes
That's
down
pretty
to
much
metering.
the difference.
It has nothing to do with like the length of the writing or maybe even the subject matter.
Ah, that could be debated. If it doesn't, there's epics, and then there are also like mock epics. I think it's still Alexander Pope who wrote The Rape of the Lock, which is about an epic-ized guy cutting off a lock of a different girl's hair, and it's like a big scandal. But it's a mock epic, and so it's poking fun at the high kind of minded epics of like, you know, the Iliad, Aeneid, different things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so it tends to be, I think epics do tend to have length. There's a certain heftiness expected, yeah, from an epic, and probably also expected to cover a certain amount of ground. And there's a reason we have the associations with the word epic to mean something on a grand scale. So yeah.
Okay, cool. And we also spoke a little bit about translations yesterday, and I was wondering, because you brought up the Iliad and Beowulf yesterday, if I were to read it, it would be in English. And so for translations in general, for poetry, do many of the translators really try to work hard to keep the metering and like the rhyme scheme the same, or like how does that usually work? Like, do you usually lose something in translation, or do most people think that translations are pretty good preservations of text?
It depends on what you're looking for, and it depends on who's translating. So you can find translations of the original Greek versions of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and some translators choose to take each line and translate it as literally as they can, and then that's the line. Some people try to preserve a sense of the sounds that are being continued, the assonance or consonants, or the repetition of certain sounds, and they try to maintain that, and that's their primary focus. Some, like Alexander Pope, who put it in iambic pentameter with rhyming couplets, that was very much not what the original Greek was like, but he was still maintaining the ideas that were happening in each line. And if he didn't cover them in each line, he'd cover them around it to retool it just a little bit. So luckily, there's usually a lot of different translations that you can take a peek at for the different major epics, at least, that were written in other languages besides English, if that's what you're looking for. But then from that point, I couldn't tell you what's the best way to do it. I think there is always going to be something lost in translation, just because it is translation and it's not how the texts were originally conceived. It's just, it's different. And because of the sake that it is different, I don't know. Do you find translations of works, be it poetry or prose, Like, you find yourself wondering very often, like, I wonder what it would be like to experience this in the original language.
Yeah, I do. Um, I wonder what is lost, and I guess I never thought about the different flavors of like a poem or like a piece of writing. How you could be trying to preserve like the general like idea of it, um, like the general idea of it supposed of it being like lyrical or of it having some sort of like rhythm in the way that Alexander Pope might have done for the Iliad, or whether or not it's kind of like purely academic or more so academic where they're really trying to just get all the words right so that they have it preserved, or whether it's um, you know sonically correct and you have like the same alliteration that you might have. I haven't I've never thought of the different flavors of translation, but what it did make me think of was when we read the book of Genesis for Digital North before we actually began recording episodes of Digital North. Because I remember reading the Bible, and that was one of the first times I think I had looked at a Bible as an adult, and um, I remember it was so tedious to read it because of the way that it was written, and I don't know if it was translated in a way where they tried to translate every word correctly, and because of that, some of the artistic quality of it was lost from the Hebrew or Latin that it was translated from. Um, yeah, it just made me think of like times that I've read other books in a different language and thought like, this can't be very this like this. There has to be something more here. And it also makes me think of like if I'm watching anime or something that's either like not very well translated or like dubbed into English, how it can just be so over the top and goofy and like ridiculous. But then also like if it's just subtitled, but the subtitles aren't necessarily well done, it is often like too melodramatic for me to just not have to laugh at it.
Yeah. um, yeah, no, it's difficult for me to get excited about reading translations, I guess. And I kind of say that like a confession because I feel like I should feel kind of guilty about that. And in some ways I do because I shouldn't not read Gabriel Garcia Marquez because it's translated work.
Is that what is he the author of?
He wrote like
Don Quixote?
he wrote Love in a Time of Cholera.
Oh,
He wrote 100 Years of Solitude. All books that I have heard wonderful things about. Um, but I don't know what the block of just I don't know. It shouldn't prevent me. I should read it anyway. And I should discover who translated it and discover if they worked with Gabriel Garcia Marquez or whatever author. Um, yeah.
well, I so the only time that I've really tried to read a book which is well, it's strange because both of the times that I've written like translated works and let me back up. The only languages I can speak are English and now a little bit of Norwegian. And when
Hmm.
we had our discussion on E. Cummings again before we began recording episodes, I tried to read E. Cummings in Norwegian, and with
Ooh.
the way that E. Cummings writes made it just too daunting for me. But I am reading a translation of Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut in Norwegian right now, and it's 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 on the cusp of my reading ability right now. But I found that I get a lot of the same sense of like wonder and kind of like confuse, almost like I don't know, not quite nihilism, but like surrender to like the power of like things around the narrator. That I am reading that translated work and I really like it, but I guess I don't really have much experience beyond that.
Yeah, I think my fear that something is lost often is overblown because when I say something is always lost in translation, um, it's important to remember that you might not be losing very much, and that is a distinct possibility that whoever's translating is just doing a wonderful job and keeping the tone and the spirit correct. And I'd imagine with someone, to go back to Gigi Marquez, he's so well known that I'm pretty certain that they'd get a good translator to do his work, and so that shouldn't really stop me.
Is it written in Spanish, his original work?
Yep, I think so.
And luckily there are a lot of English and Spanish speakers in the world, so there's likely to be someone who is fluent in both and can.
Yeah, I'd imagine.
Yeah. How would you feel about reading the third poem, which you suggested to me for this episode? Poem 7.
Could certainly do that. 1 second. I actually just have to pull it up here.
Okay, no problem. It's a E. E. Cummings poem, again, which I enjoyed, but I also think I kind of have a predisposition to want to enjoy E. E. Cummings because it's a name I'm familiar with, and I've read a fair amount of his work before. So I was pretty happy when you suggested this poem.
Yeah, he's definitely a poet that I admire quite a bit, for different reasons. But here we go, poem 7. If up's the word, and a world grows greener, minute by second, and most by more. If death is the loser, and life is the winner, and beggars are rich, but the misers are poor. Let's touch the sky, with a to and a fro, and a here, there, where, and away we go. In even the laziest creature among us, a wisdom no knowledge can kill is astir. Now dull eyes are keen, and now keen eyes are keener. For young is the year, for young is the year. Let's touch the sky with a great and a gay and a steep, deep rush through amazing day. Its brains without hearts have set saint against sinner, put gain over gladness and joy under care. Let's do as an earth which can never do wrong does, minute by second and most by more. Let's touch the sky with a strange and a true and a climbing fall into the far near blue. If beggars are rich, and a robin will sing his robin a song, but misers are poor, let's love until no one could quite be. And young is the year, dear, as living as I'm as you're. Let's touch the sky with a you and a me, and in every who's any who's some, one who's we.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mr. Cummings. What I really like about this poem is that not only is it written in, I guess, E. E. Cummings' typical way of writing poetry, which is a completely atypical way of writing, and with a lot of experimentation for where he wants to set his words and what he kind of
lots
wants
of parentheses.
to say. Yeah, lots of parentheses, and just kind of like a care of like the shape of his poem. But when you read it aloud, the first thing I noticed about it is it really had a lyrical quality to it. Like, not only was the poem this kind of like funky jumble of words thrown on a page, but it also sounds nice when you read it.
Mm-hmm.
So that surprised
definitely.
me even. I wasn't expecting it to be so lyrical.
Yeah, it's definitely got a rhyme scheme and a loose kind of meter to it. And he actually does that a fair amount in different poems that he writes. He keeps that kind of a jaunty quality, I guess, his writing has for me. What do you think this poem means, Ryan? What does this poem mean to you, I should ask?
That's a good question. It seems like it's kind of a celebration for life. It seems like more than anything, it's just kind of a let's seize the day kind of a poem where I read it and I feel like, if beggars are rich but misers are poor, like the idea that like I have today and I know I have today and I might as well enjoy it because the world is greener minute by second and most by more and um it, yeah, I guess it kind of galvanizes me in some way. It
Mm-hmm.
makes me, it galvanizes me in the way that like an inspirational song would. Like it makes me want to get up and do something with my day.
Hmm. Yeah, I feel similarly. I think galvanized is a good word for it. It does seem to me to be kind of a celebration of just like you said that this is the moment that we have. And I think it is the we at the end that kind of uh, with a you and a me and an every who's any who's some one who's we. A joy in being with somebody else. And he Cummings oftentimes plays around with his he's and his we's and his she's. Um, Oftentimes it's we that he's talking about, and there's a spring quality to a lot of his work too, kind of a joy and a wonder, and the way he's using the words, which is not syntactically or rather grammatically correct per se in a prose way of writing. Um, I think it helps him convey, at least in this poem, a certain kind of innocence that suggests and amplifies the kind of joy, wonder of whatever's the speaker of this poem is feeling. Um, but that being said, I do think it has some really like nice ideas that it's conveying, some nice lines that it's not just all like happy fluff, that it actually holds some ideas that like in even the laziest creature among us a wisdom no knowledge can kill. Like a wisdom no knowledge can kill is something that I at least can think about like what does that mean exactly?
Yeah.
Um
Yeah,
or in the
it literally makes me think of like animals that we would hunt, and like the idea that we
mhm,
have like the knowledge of like making a tool which can help us hunt that animal easier, but like the wisdom which comes from just kind of like living and being and kind of like
mhm,
a Taoist Buddhist sense of the word wisdom, and that like wisdom
mhm,
comes from like the act of doing and not necessarily from like the demarcation or like storage of knowledge. That kind of
mhm.
idea that like just being alive is something which needs to be celebrated for all of the like I don't know actions that can come from it.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. And the line, its brains without hearts have set saint against sinner, but
Hmm.
gain over gladness and joy under care. Like I think that's a really eloquent way of, kind of comment on society and how um, the brutality that society can achieve sometimes by just, the machine of corporate, I guess capitalism in a way. The brains without hearts have set saint against sinner. Like, I don't know. It connects to me, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And um, it does cause me to think about a world in a little differently, to
Yeah.
celebrate it, but not to say that it's perfect, but to celebrate it and use the wrong that you see as an example of what you can do better to be right.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's nice. And then also the idea of like the we, like you mentioned earlier, like
Hmm.
and a robin will sing his robin a song. It seems like this idea of like some power or like some goodness even that comes from the collective we. And like if you
Hmm.
were to embrace that, that the world might be a little bit brighter. Um,
Hmm.
that we could touch the sky even. Um, But yeah, I do like that line. It's brains without hearts have set saint against sinner, because it seems like it puts the onus, it puts like the responsibility on the saint, and it's nice because for me it makes me think of a saint being like a the responsible party which is supposed to rectify things with its sinning counterpart instead of just condemning them. Um, I
Hmm.
thought I think that's nice, and it fits with the overall kind of idea of the poem, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that those are two readings, like you said, when you touched on the we. You can either read it as kind of a love poem, because that's one way I see it. I see it as a person being just happy to be living with somebody that they're just very much like happy to be with, and everything is bright for that person, that singular person. But you could, like you said, I think another way to read it, just as valid, if not more so, which I hadn't thought of until you said it, is the collective we. Anybody who thinks like these thoughts is included in E. Cummings' we there, that you can achieve this happiness in a world, and if, I don't know, if beggars are rich but misers are poor.
This so sitting down with you and discussing these poems is like I love it. It's a ton of fun, but then it also makes me wonder again, like, do you feel that poetry is something which should be promoted more in our society? Because you said that, nothing inherently has value except for the value which humans and maybe other sentient animals like put on it,
Hmm. Yeah.
such as food or reproduction or things like that.
Uh-huh.
Um, but like, do you like what would you imagine a society where like poetic literacy was at a much higher level than it is currently in America? What do you think would be the influence or the impact from that?
It's an interesting question. I think, um, I mean, first of all, I don't know whether there are conservative poets like modern day talking, and whether if that, because the poems that I read tend to be more liberal in their ideas and the emotions that they're conveying. And if it was those poems that people would have a greater literacy in, I think it would build a more compassionate and understanding society. I I think everybody should have a chance at poetry. More specifically, everybody should have a chance at reading something that means something to them. Because once you read something that holds meaning to you, I think that makes somebody a lot more excited about seeking out poetry further, or even just language further. Um, and a lot of schools just kind of, I feel, kill that. When you go to school, you're taught, these are the good poets. These are like the reasons that people have always said they're good.
Got to read Shakespeare. Got to read
Yeah,
um, Poe.
and like, I mean, I enjoy reading Shakespeare. I enjoy reading Poe, but not everybody is going to find that their cup of tea. They're not going to connect with it, or want to connect with it. And it might turn them off the idea of poetry in general because they had a couple bad experiences with things that they didn't relate to. That being said, I really think there's enough poetry out there where everybody could read something that meant something to them and that could give them a greater understanding of who they are, of society, of a person who's different from them. Um, so yeah, I think even though poetry, if it vanished from culture altogether, I don't think humanity would, grind to a halt or stop or self-destruct just because of that. I do think if it was promoted more, that people would be able to have at least the chance at gaining greater compassion.
Hmm. Who are some poets which you recommend? Like what? Because one of the barriers for me reading new poetry is the fact that I don't know who to look at. I know that you and our mutual friend Thomas Harms from Digital North, like talking about Saul Williams a lot, and he's a contemporary poet. But who are some poets who I guess are your go-tos, or who you just like really think people should read, or are universally praised, or really take it however you want? Who are some poets that we should know about for whatever reason?
That's a tough one. I like the beat poets quite a bit. Your Jack Kerouacs, your Allen Ginsbergs, Gregor Corsos, Gary Snyder's. I like them all for little different reasons, but collectively, I enjoy the emotion that they're conveying. The kind of newness that it still holds for me appeals to me, and in its kind of rawness almost. They talk about things that I find interesting, and they talk about them in ways that I find inventive and cool. So I get lots out of it. I'm able to find interesting catharsis in the Beat Generation poets and authors of prose. I like Sylvia Plath. Her style of writing is also cathartic for me in different things she's written. I enjoy the three poets quite a bit that we have gone over some of their poetry: the E. Cummings, Sylvia Legris, and Robert Frost. I enjoy Alexander Pope quite a bit. I think his translations of the Iliad and Odyssey are quite spectacular, and his other work. Robert Browning is also kind of a romantic poet that I like. William Blake, Gerard Manley Hopkins has some really good nature images. Emily Dickinson is fun to read and quite I think a joy for her observational and powers. And then there's a number of other poets that I couldn't, because none of who I just listed except for Sylvia Legris is a contemporary poet. And so my knowledge of contemporary poetry is actually kind of woefully inadequate compared to my knowledge of past poets. And I do read the Poetry magazine and follow a couple of different poets, but I don't know them by name. It is a good way, though, to keep connected to what's going on in the poetry world, whether it's this magazine or I'm sure there's numbers of other ones that you can get that are compilations or different, reviews of contemporary poetry. And that's a good way to find poetry, too, because you'll read it and maybe you'll only like two of the poets that are in the whole thing. But if you find those two poets, then you've found a whole body of work that you can pursue.
Yeah.
So.
Okay.
William Carlos. Yeah.
What was the last one?
William Carlos Williams. It's good.
Carlos Williams. Is he contemporary?
T.S. Eliot's good. No, he was kind of right before the Beats, though not in a similar style per se, but
pre-beat. The rhythm.
Not necessarily a pre-beat, but just that's when he lived.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, now I have a wealth of authors that I can choose from that I didn't have before. Some of the names are pretty familiar to me, but I'm happy to have some recommendations for you. It'll help keep me from guessing whether or not I should read a poem. Maybe that'll be a good jumping off point for me.
You know exactly what not to read now. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. Nate, thank you so much for meeting with me these past 2 days, and I'm glad that you were able to give me some recommendations. Third time is the charm.
Yeah. Boy, we did it.
We did it. Thanks so much, man. I'll see you soon.
Hey, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of Learner's Permit. You can now download all of our podcast episodes of both Learner's Permit and Digital North, as well as stream both of them by visiting us at curiousmagnet.com. And make sure to stay up to date on our new releases by following us on Facebook at The Curious Magnet. We'll also continue to release all of our episodes on YouTube, so if you prefer, you can watch us that way. Thanks so much, and stay curious.